My phone buzzed on the desk while I was at work, half buried in emails and project deadlines. I assumed it was just another notification. However, I noticed her name, my wife, Sarah, when I looked at the computer. A note: no more kisses, no more intimacy. That was it. No background, no justification, just a factual statement. I initially believed it to be a joke, albeit a dry and harsh one. I even started drafting a reply along the lines of, "Haha, what's that supposed to mean?" But I had a gut feeling that urged me to stop before I could send it. This was not a humorous situation. It was a proclamation. I read the message again as if the words would alter, and I just gazed at it. They didn't. There was no combat here. This had not been the result of any disagreement. Actually, all we had been talking about lately had been meaningless discussions about work, supper, and weekend plans that never materialized. Nevertheless, this was final. Something that had been dying for a while was being put to death. My thoughts were racing as I leaned back in my chair and locked my phone. How should I respond to this situation? Was she expressing her desire for a divorce in this way? Did she have another partner? Or was she simply finished with me? After many minutes, I took up my phone once more and typed, "Is everything okay?" No answer. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. Then 30. Nothing. I verified that the communication had been sent. She had read it. She simply didn't want to respond. That resonated more deeply than the words she had sent. She had made a choice about me, not simply about intimacy. Furthermore, she didn't even believe I was deserving of an explanation. I attempted to focus on my work, yet I found myself sidetracked. I made a few calls and answered emails, but it seemed like I was watching someone else perform my duties from a distance. My thoughts returned to the quiet house where my wife had just drawn a boundary that I hadn't anticipated. By lunchtime, I had reached my limit. I went outside and headed toward the parking lot while calling her number. The call went straight to voicemail. I gave it another go. The outcome remained the same. She was not paying attention to me. I waited for a call or text that I knew would never come while sitting in my car, holding onto the wheel and gazing at my phone's blank screen. I'd sensed her retreating for months. However, I told myself it was because of habit, stress, and life getting in the way. I had persuaded myself that we would eventually bridge whatever gap had developed between us. However, she was shutting the door. I now had an option. I may demand an explanation or plead for an answer. Or I might accept that our marriage, if it remained, had been reduced to a single text message. I had mentally rehearsed every situation by the time I pulled into the driveway that night. Perhaps she had an unrelated grievance. Perhaps this was merely an attempt to get my attention. Or perhaps, just possibly, she would be waiting inside to clarify the true meaning of that message. I got out of the car and stood looking at the front door for a while. Everything had the same appearance. As usual, there was a little flicker in the porch light. As they had been that morning, the living room's drapes were partially closed. It was odd how everything seemed regular on the outside, yet on the inside, everything had already altered. I opened the door and got inside. There she was, sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone as if nothing had occurred. She wasn't even watching the stupid sitcom that was on the TV. When I walked in, she hardly looked up. No salutations, no recognition, nothing. After placing my keys on the table, I inhaled deeply. "All right, let's begin," I said, "Hey," attempting to speak evenly. She said, "Hey," without raising her gaze. That was it. I waited for her to say something else, perhaps an apology, an explanation, or even just some strained small conversation to diffuse the situation. However, no. She continued to scroll. I moved in closer. "So, do you want to talk about your text?" After letting out a long, frustrated sigh, she looked up at last. "What about it?" I saw my jaw getting tense. "How about it? You said no more kisses, no more intimacy. That's not exactly a normal thing to text your husband in the middle of the day." She gave a shrug. I meant what I said. Quiet. As if the conversation had ended and this was just another Tuesday, she returned to her phone. I kept my eyes on her, waiting for her to say something, anything at all, to explain this. However, nothing appeared. The weight of the room was pressing down on me. The aloof conduct I had been observing for months was not the same as this. This was not evasion. This was a lack of interest. It was worse than that. I forced myself to remain composed and took a seat in the chair across from her. Why? Still avoiding eye contact, she shrugged half-heartedly and said, "I don't feel like it anymore." That was all. No regret. Not depressed. She made a statement that seemed disconnected, as though she was discussing a show that she had grown disinterested in. I reiterated, "You don't feel like it anymore," as though stating it aloud would somehow make it seem less ridiculous. She gave a nod. "Yeah, I waited. Is that all?" I pondered. "After years of dating, that's all you have to say?" Something broke inside of me, but it wasn't what I had anticipated. I wasn't upset. I wasn't even as hurt as I ought to have been. I had just finished. I took a deep breath and sat back in my chair. Okay, that was my answer. Only one word. She gave me a startled look at that moment, as if she thought I would argue, plead, or demand a fight. However, I refused to provide her with that level of enjoyment. Was she ready to finish? All right. I got up and moved past her on my way to our bedroom. I did not slam the door. I didn't scream or swear. I simply entered, sat on the bed's edge, and gazed at the luggage in the closet's corner. I had not yet decided whether or not to pack. However, I realized for the first time that I was not going to stay. For what seemed like an eternity, I sat on the edge of the bed and gazed at the partially zippered bag in the closet. The idea of going had already taken root in my thoughts, even though I wasn't packing yet. It was more than just a response to her message or her lack of interest. It was the knowledge that she had already let go of the thing I had been battling for. Aside from the faint buzz of the TV in the living room, the house was quiet. She hadn't followed me. She hadn't inquired about my well-being. She hadn't given enough thought to question my thoughts. I wasn't going to shrug and send a text message to finish this. After getting up, I made my way back into the living room and positioned myself in front of the television. When she finally looked up, her expression was unreadable, no remorse or rage, just slight irritation, as if I were disturbing her evening. "We're going to talk," I stated in a stern yet restrained tone. With a sigh, she placed her phone on the armrest. "About what?" It nearly made me chuckle. "What is it about?" I folded my arms. "You don't think you owe me an explanation?" She looked at me as if I were making a big deal out of nothing while leaning back on the couch. "I already told you. I don't feel like it anymore," I retorted. "That's not an explanation. That's an excuse." She rolled her eyes. What do you want me to say?" I inhaled deeply, attempting to control my annoyance. "I want the truth." She cocked her head slightly, as though she was debating whether or not to offer me that. At last, she replied, "The truth is, I don't love you the way I used to. I don't feel the same. I don't want the same things anymore." It was there. The words were quiet, almost practiced, as if she had already accepted them before speaking them out. I was hoping for more, some hint of uncertainty or regret, some indication that she didn't like the way this was going. However, nothing was present. I nodded to myself and stepped back. "All right." She arched an eyebrow. "That's it?" I said. "What else is there? You're done. You checked out a long time ago. You're just now letting me know." She didn't dispute it. She simply averted her gaze and grabbed her phone once more. That was it. Don't fight, don't yell, don't cry. Nothing but quiet. Two persons must be willing to participate in a confrontation. Here, however, there was no conflict, just an ending that was predetermined. I finally understood, so I turned around and left, not because I was giving up. Nothing remained for which to fight. Without making a commotion or slamming the door, I simply closed it with finality as I made my way back to the bedroom. I wouldn't have cared enough to fight for this if she didn't. I sat on the bed with my head blank, staring at nothing in particular. I had just finished. Then something nagged at me, a feeling I had neglected for too long, a voice in the back of my mind. Her lack of interest had not been sudden. It took some time for it to happen. Individuals don't suddenly decide that their marriage is over. There was a change. I needed to discover what had changed. After a moment of hesitation, I reached for my phone and checked our phone bill. I craved answers, but I wasn't proud of it. I examined the phone log for any unusual activity. It took very little time. I kept seeing the same number late at night, early in the morning, and throughout lunch breaks. I entered the number into a search bar after copying it. A generic carrier listing appeared instead of a name. I considered calling it for a second. I looked at our shared location history instead. Years ago, when we genuinely cared about one another's whereabouts, we had connected our accounts. I hadn't given it much thought. It was present when I retrieved the timeline. The location was a hotel, a bar. The incident occurred in an unidentified residential building across town. It happened more than once or twice. It happened often. I initially felt nothing when I sat back with my phone in hand, just a calm sense of conviction, similar to solving a jigsaw and seeing that the picture was precisely what you expected. I ought to have been incensed. Instead, I ought to have barged into the living room and demanded explanations. I ought to have screamed or hurled my phone against the wall. However, I didn't. Rather, I got up, went to the closet, and lowered my bag. I wasn't just staring at it this time. I was packing. It felt like I was severing yet another string that had been keeping me here with each article of clothing. I snatched, and every item I threw into the bag. I was only thinking about the fact that I wasn't staying not where I was going. I sensed footsteps behind me halfway through. She crossed her arms and stood in the doorway. "What are you doing?" Her inquiry remained unanswered as I closed the suitcase. There was a slight alteration in her expression, perhaps a hint of surprise, but not enough to be significant. "So that's it," she said in a flat voice. I looked over at her. "You made your choice. Now I'm making mine." She didn't dispute it, didn't inquire about what I knew, didn't attempt to clarify. Since she was aware, I did the same. As I fastened my final belongings, the zipper hummed as I yanked the bag off the bed. I moved steadily and deliberately. No hesitancy or second-guessing was present. I had no intention of asking inquiries. She had no intention of providing an explanation, therefore, I wasn't going to insist on it. Her arms were still crossed as she stood in the doorway, observing me without intervening or begging. She questioned, "You're really doing this?" I didn't raise my eyes. "Yeah." She exhaled slowly, but it was devoid of any true feeling, neither regret nor sorrow. Perhaps a slight surprise, as though she had assumed that I would simply accept everything and continue to exist in the meaningless void she had pushed our marriage into. I flung my jacket over my arm after grabbing it from the chair. I could see it clearly when I finally looked her in the eyes. She was already over it. It should have hurt to realize that. Perhaps it would have months ago. However, it has now simply made things easier. I dragged my bag behind me as I passed her. The wheels softly hummed on the hardwood floor. She remained in place. I had to get away from her. Not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to have one last look at what I was leaving behind. I halted as I got to the front door. It was the same house. The furnishings remained the same. The ornaments remained the same. The air freshener she always used had the same subtle lavender aroma. However, it was no longer ours. I twisted the handle. She said, "Where are you going?" I nearly burst out laughing at the question. It seemed as though she held it in high regard, like she genuinely gave a damn. I didn't respond. I simply opened the door and went outdoors. The cool air carried the distant noises of neighbors going about their evenings and cars passing by. Despite the fact that my life had just taken a drastic and irrevocable change, the world continued to move on. When I got to my car, I tossed the suitcase in the trunk. She was still standing in the doorway as I turned back to face the house. She might say anything to stop me. I thought for a moment. She offered a grudging apology. This was a weak attempt to justify the situation, a last-ditch effort to salvage what remained. However, she didn't. She remained still, and that provided me with all the information I required. Without saying another word, I got into the driver's seat, turned on the engine, and drove out of the driveway. I neglected to look in my rearview mirror. I didn't have to. I let the road spread out in front of me as I drove for miles without a destination. The buzz of tires on the pavement filled the silence as streetlights flickered by. I disregarded my phone's repeated buzzing in the cup holder. I knew it wasn't her already. She had no intention of calling. She had no intention of asking me to return. I also had no intention of waiting for her to. I eventually stopped at a petrol station, more out of habit than need. I leaned against the car as I walked outside and breathed in the refreshing night air. I hardly saw anything, even though there were a few trucks parked off to the side and some adolescents hanging around the convenience store entrance. After taking my phone out of my pocket, I looked through my contacts. I kept my thumb over her name. I had no idea why. I refrained from calling. There was nothing more I could say. Perhaps I was simply recognizing that it was final, that a name on a screen formerly had meaning, but now it was just another entry I didn't require. I tapped it a few times and erased it. The phone number was hers. We have a history of text messages sent to her. Every message. Each call log lost. Even the occasion seemed inconsequential. However, it wasn't. I owned it. I climbed back into the vehicle and resumed my journey. No strategy. Simply move forward without using a GPS. I checked into a hotel off the highway a few hours later. It was a simple room with a desk, a bed, and a window that looked out onto the parking lot. It made no difference. It served just as a halt. She didn't own the place. I sat on the bed, put my suitcase down, and let out a breath. I felt light for the first time in a long time. I wasn't frustrated at all, not depressed. I have no regrets. Simply a silent acknowledgement that this was how things were always supposed to finish. She had decided, and I'd made mine now. I would work out the details tomorrow, including my destination and future steps. I didn't need explanations, though, tonight. I was free tonight. I woke up in that modest motel room the morning after I left, feeling oddly clear-headed. There was no misunderstanding. There was no doubt about the necessary actions. The union had ended. It was irretrievable. No need to prolong it with meaningless discussions or coerced reconciliation. I had to formally announce it. I started by gathering the proof. I had the late-night calls, the strange locations, and the phone records previously. That was plenty to validate my concerns. But I wanted evidence, something that could not be denied. After a brief conversation with a lawyer, I decided to engage a private investigator. He delivered in a short amount of time. In just a few days, I had detailed evidence of my wife's extramarital affair, including pictures and timestamps. I wasn't shocked. I had even lost my anger. I promptly filed for divorce. The attorney reassured me that I had power because of the infidelity evidence. I had no desire for vengeance. I just wanted to make sure I took what was rightly mine when I left. When I issued her the divorce papers, she reacted with the icy disdain I anticipated. Don't cry, don't beg, no explanation. She hardly looked twice before signing them. She simply said it to inquire as to when I would be packing up my belongings. I went back to the house one last time, only to grab what was rightfully mine, without negotiating or talking. As soon as I entered, I became aware of something. I had no feelings. The home, the furnishings. We had created a life together. All of it was merely a collection of meaningless items. As I packed, she observed, didn't offer assistance, made no attempt to stop me. I never turned around after leaving my keys on the counter and leaving the room. We completed the divorce in a matter of months. We sanitized it thoroughly, effective, and as emotionless as ever, like our final years together. I seized my rights and departed. More significantly, I left with my independence. And it was the true triumph. I wasted no time thinking about the past. There was no use in speculating about what might have gone wrong or attempting to pinpoint the precise moment our marriage had collapsed. The chapter was closed. I created a new life, a new location, new routines, and new priorities. And I was pleased for the first time in a long time. No more speculating. Stop waiting for someone to show concern. She had asked for space, and I had granted it. I had also taken my. The initial weeks following the divorce were peculiar. It's just different, but not horrible. For a considerable amount of time, I had been striving to maintain stability in a situation that had already crumbled, navigating with caution and experiencing constant stress. The tension had subsided. Avoid being too cautious. Simply be silent. On the opposite side of town, I took a tiny apartment. A one-bedroom apartment overlooking a parking lot wasn't much, but it was mine. I was under no obligation to disclose it. I didn't have to be concerned about the expectations or feelings of others. In a surprising way, it felt liberating. I threw myself into my work because I was enjoying it again, not because I needed the diversion. I discovered that I was more creative and focused when I wasn't burdened by a failing marriage. I began taking on initiatives that I had previously been too exhausted to think about. I also began getting back in touch with friends that I had lost touch with throughout the years. It felt awkward at first. When I revealed the divorce to them, several of them struggled to find the right words. Others attempted to give me unnecessary counsel. Eventually, however, a new rhythm was established. But things weren't always easy. On some nights, the loneliness was more intense than I had anticipated. There were nights when I would lie in bed and gaze at the ceiling, questioning whether I had made the correct decision. However, those times went by. Additionally, they dwindled in number with time. About a month after the divorce was finalized, I received a call one evening from an unidentified number. Something urged me to answer, even though I nearly didn't. Hey, I'm here. Sarah was the one. I gripped the phone tighter as I froze. What are you looking for? She seemed to be struggling to figure out how to say whatever it was she needed to say, as evidenced by the pause on the other end. All I wanted to do was check in, check out how you're doing. It nearly made me chuckle. You want to see how I'm doing? Right now? I know it's strange, she blurted out, but lately I've been thinking about us a lot regarding all that took place. And I simply wanted to apologize. I took a while to reply. I couldn't think of anything to say. She went on, her voice softer now. I know I messed up. I am aware that I caused you pain. And I'm sorry about that. I genuinely do. I took a seat on the couch and combed my hair. Sarah, why are you phoning me? Let's pause for one more moment. I'm not sure. I suppose I just wanted to apologize to you. The way things ended wasn't what I intended. I breathed out slowly. However, they did. You also made your decisions. I understand, she murmured quietly. Furthermore, I'm not pleading for pardon. I simply wanted to express it. Then there was a long stillness. On the other end, I could hear her breathing, which was irregular and shallow, as if she were trying to contain her emotions. Eventually, she said, I hope you're doing okay. I truly meant it when I said, I am. She took a while to reply. Her voice was no more than a whisper when she spoke. All right. That's good. Shortly after that, we hung up, and I sat there looking at my phone for a while. I didn't become upset. I was not depressed. I felt nothing at all. And perhaps the most telling of all was that Sarah and I met up at the grocery store a few weeks later. It was embarrassing, to say the least. She was standing there with a basket in her hand when I looked up from the cereal aisle, where I was arguing between two granola brands. She had a new appearance, weary. She wore an enormous sweater that did little to conceal the tiny bump of her pregnancy, and her hair was pushed back in an untidy bun. We simply stared at one another for a while, unsure of what to say. Finally, in a hushed voice, she whispered, Hey. Hey, I said, just as hesitantly. A protracted, awkward stillness fell. I couldn't think of anything to say. How was she doing, may I ask? Should I act as though nothing went wrong? How are you doing? She broke the stillness by asking. I gave a shrug. I've been doing fine. You? She avoided looking at me, instead focusing on her basket. It's been a lot. Unsure of how to react, I nodded. Sarah continued. Emily told me she called you, after a little pause. Yeah, I replied in a bland tone. She did. With a sigh, Sarah combed through her hair. No one asked her to do that. I don't know, but I didn't want you to think. I didn't want you to believe that you were essential to me in any way. I arched an eyebrow. Do you? After a moment of hesitation, she shook her head. No, I don't. That same unyielding independence and her refusal to acknowledge that she could want assistance were back. All right, I responded plainly. It took another awkward time for us to stand there before Sarah spoke again. Her voice was hardly audible above a whisper as she apologized. I blinked in surprise. For what purpose? For everything, she continued, continuing to avoid eye contact, for the way things turned out, for failing to hear you, for excluding you. I took a while to reply. I couldn't think of anything to say. Her voice broke as she trailed off. I believed I could manage this. I believed I could handle it by myself, but it's more difficult than I anticipated. I nodded, experiencing an unexpected spectrum of feelings. A part of me wanted to reassure her that everything would be all right. However, a different aspect of me, the one that had been so severely wounded, resisted. At last I remarked, I'm sorry you're having difficulties. However, Sarah, this was your decision. It was obvious that you didn't require my assistance. Furthermore, I can no longer be the person you turn to in times of need. Something I couldn't quite place filled her eyes as she glanced up at me. Feeling sorry? Sadness? I wasn't certain. I understand, she murmured quietly. Furthermore, I don't think you will be. I only wanted to apologize. Unsure of what else to say, I nodded once more. After another period of standing, Sarah finally took up her basket and left. I had a weird sense of closure as I watched her leave. It was this. That was the end. I never saw Sarah again after that uncomfortable incident at the grocery store. Through mutual acquaintances, I learned tidbits about her, especially from Emily, who continued to get in touch with me occasionally, despite my explicit request not to be dragged back into Sarah's sphere of influence. Sarah had hoped that the surrogacy would go easily, but it didn't. Emily and her husband had to intervene more than they had intended when she experienced problems halfway through the pregnancy. Although I didn't inquire about specifics, I got the impression that it was difficult for all parties. I experienced a twinge of pity. Sarah had always been incredibly self-assured and confident in her choices. It must have been difficult for her to watch her struggle like that. However, I couldn't allow myself to become enmeshed in it. I had to restore my own life and safeguard my own tranquility. I immersed myself in my work, my interests, and re-establishing connections with the aspects of myself that I had lost over the years. I had not painted since college, so I started up again. I spent weekends exploring routes I had never had the time or energy to do previously after joining a local hiking organization. Not everything was simple. On other nights, the loneliness struck more forcefully than I had anticipated, and I found myself staring at the ceiling and questioning whether I had made the right decision. However, those times went by. Additionally, they dwindled in number with time. With hesitation at first, I resumed dating. Putting myself out there after all this time felt weird. However, I met Jess, a woman who made me laugh in a manner I hadn't in a long time. She was fiercely independent, caring, and grounded. It was not necessary for me to fix her, and she wasn't in need of me fixing her. We simply fit. It wasn't flawless. There is never anything. However, it was genuine. And I felt like I was right where I should be for the first time in a long time. I reconnected with Sarah a year after the divorce was finalized. It took place at a downtown coffee shop. While I was waiting in line for my regular order, I noticed her sitting at a table by the window. A book was open in front of her, but she didn't appear to be reading it. She was by herself. I thought for a second about turning around and walking away, but something stopped me in my tracks. Curiosity, perhaps. It might have been closure. In any case, I approached her table. "Hey," I said, in a quiet voice. Startled, she looked up, and for a moment, I noticed a glimmer of something surprise, perhaps even relief in her eyes. She closed her book and said, "Hey, would you mind if I sat?" I gestured toward the empty chair across from her and made the request. She nodded after hesitating. "Yes." I placed my coffee on the table between us and took a seat. We were both unsure of what to say, so there was a long quiet. "How are you doing?" Finally, I asked. She traced the edge of the cup with her fingertips and shrugged. "All right, I suppose." "It has been a lot." I nodded without asking specifics. "And you?" She looked up at me and inquired. "To be honest," I said, "I've been good. Very good." Although it didn't quite reach her eyes, she grinned. "I'm happy." The weight of everything left unsaid hung between us, as there was another pause. I added cautiously, "I heard the surrogacy was tough." She laughed briefly and without amusement. That would be an understatement. It was more difficult than I anticipated. Much more difficult. I waited for her to continue without saying anything. "I believed I could manage it," she murmured quietly. "I believed I was doing something admirable and altruistic, but I didn't know how much it cost me." I nodded, experiencing an unexpected spectrum of feelings. A part of me wanted to let her know that I had attempted to show her how much this would impact her, and that I had warned her. However, I didn't. She didn't need to hear that. Instead, I said, "I'm sorry it was so hard." At that moment, her eyes were filled with something I couldn't quite identify. Feeling sorry? Sadness? Appreciation? "I apologize too," she muttered. "For everything." I took a while to reply. I couldn't think of anything to say. She went on, "I don't expect you to forgive me," her voice cracking. "However, I wanted you to know that I now realize how deeply I offended you. I apologize as well." I inhaled deeply, allowing her words to fully register. Eventually, I said, "I forgive you." Startled, she blinked. "You do?" I gave a nod. "I do. It's not that what you did was acceptable, but rather that it serves neither of our interests to hold on to it. Sarah, I've moved on. I'm hoping you can, too." She tried not to cry as she gazed down at her hands, her shoulders trembling. "I'm grateful," she muttered. For a long time, we sat there silently, allowing the burden of everything to fall between us. I finished my coffee and got up to leave. "Sarah, take care of yourself," I replied softly. She gazed up at me with optimism in her eyes, which I hadn't seen in a while. "You too," she murmured quietly. Feeling lighter than I have in years, I left the coffee shop and stepped outside into the sunlight. This was not how I had anticipated things would end. The conclusion wasn't what I had hoped for. However, that was the conclusion I required, and it was sufficient.